So just this little start, I think, is a nice illustration. These are a couple of students who were looking at whether invertebrates are transported in the green hay. So on the right of the picture is a big forage harvester, which is what we use to collect the seed when we're restoring meadows to transport and then spread on the new meadow. And this was a little kind of preliminary look at whether invertebrates are transported with the seed into the new meadows, i.e. can you inoculate the meadows with invertebrates? It was just a kind of one-off, and we used emergence traps, and nothing emerged, but one needs to get on with the sort of microscopes and see what happens there. But this is the farmer that we work with in the restoration. So again, for me, the picture really illustrates our kind of mission, as it were. But it all emerges from here. This is Longmead, an ancient 1,000-year-old meadow, has had the same management since the Doomsday. Kevin and I have owned it for the last quarter of a century, and I have been managing it as a farm for its crop, but also for wildlife. And for the last 20 years, I've been running school visits, and what used to be called care farming is now called social farming, working with adults with learning disability and autism. So, and Kevin, who could tell you himself, except he's on mute, is a neurophysiologist and set up the world's first interdisciplinary institute to study the brain in the early 1990s. The idea of a network of people from all different disciplines to look at how the brain works. And when he came back in 2018 from Zurich, he suggested we should try and do the same thing for the ecosystem of floodplain meadows, since they were still relatively poorly understood. So bringing together as many people from different disciplines as possible. But then we realized that there is only about 1,200 hectares of this particular habitat, MG4 grassland, left in the UK. Which is about the size of Heathrow Airport. And so if we sat around for 20 years studying it, the knowledge would be useless, because actually there would be nothing left. But the amazing thing is that on this bend of the Thames between Oxford and Longmead, we're up at Ensham, and further up, 25% of the remaining habitat in the UK lies here, including, with Pixie and Yarnton-Mead, the largest contiguous area of this, what's known as MG4 grassland in the UK. So we thought that alongside the research, we would try and see if, by kind of talking to neighbours and neighbours, we could recreate meadows in the intervening fields to create a nature recovery network of meadows. It was around the time, this was 2018, of the government's 25-year plan for nature, when they were talking about nature recovery networks, and then the Environment Bill, which has eventually become the Environment Act. And of course, the idea of connecting up has been around for some time. The John Lawton's bigger, it's not bigger, better, more joined up. That's what everybody says. It's, I'll tell you in the next slide because I can't remember. It's bigger, better, and joined up, I think is the thing. So at this stage, we started getting invited to county level meetings. Everybody was discussing how you create nature recovery networks. And we found ourselves slightly just ahead of the game. So here's one: bigger, better, and joined up. So since 2018, we have connected up around 210 hectares of species-rich floodplain meadow along the Thames around Swinford and Ensham. So the yellow here is our project. we haven't created 210 hectares. We've created about 70 hectares, just connecting up original meadows. So this is Longmead. Can you see the cursor?
Yeah.
So then downstream, these are the big, this is Cassington Mead, Yarnton Mead, and these are all triple SIs, Pixie Mead. And then further down, we have a couple of ancient meadows there. And then, of course, the Marston Meads and Park Farm that you all are involved with. This is, of course, Hinksey Meadow, which is under threat from the flood alleviation scheme. I should say that since last year, Longmead is also under threat. On this other bank is, so I keep losing my cursor, here is Swinford Meadows, which belongs to the Oxford Preservation Trust, also ancient species-rich meadow. The Botley West Solar Park is currently planning to put its cable through both Longmead and Swinford Meadows. So despite their extreme rarity, these meadows continue to be under threat. But the interesting thing about this area is not just that it's rich in ancient meadows, but since the early 2000s, a number of adjoining fields have been put into Natural England's agri-environment schemes. And so we have some really nice sort of 20-year-old meadows that are getting relatively species rich. So around here, there's a very nice sort of band around the ancient meadows, Wharton Meadows, belong to Wharton Farm here, and then upstream upstream of Longmead, there's a large 100-acre restoration that's also about 20 years old. And then here at Pink Hill Farm are meadows that we restored in 2013. At that time, we weren't actively involved in the actual preparation groundwork itself. Our seed, the seed from Longmead, was restored, and it was done by a neighbouring farmer, a friend of ours. But the yellow is our restoration work, either already done or scheduled. And then down here, the dotted lines represent fields that have plans for restoration in principle. And then,
could you speak about the agri-environment schemes? What's being done there? Is that very similar to what you're doing on
yes,
yes,
exactly the same. But has been, and they slightly are under the radar. In fact, these areas around, well, all these areas that have been under restoration for 20 years are still on the maps, represented either as improved grassland or floodplain grazing marsh. And so there is a question of ground truthing the maps really before one makes grand plans for nature recovery, just to ensure that you're in the right habitat. And then in Oxford, I met John James, head gardener of Christchurch, in 2020, and suggested that Christchurch Meadows was ripe for restoration, and he thought it was a great idea. And so we started with Christchurch Meadows in 2020. In 2021, Merton College head gardener came to us and asked us if we could help them restore 2 meadows for Merton, which are actually in St. Cat's on the Charwell, Great Meadow and Music Meadow. So we did that in 2021. And then the University Parks have come to us and said, there's a little bit of the University Parks also on the Charwell. But originally they said, oh, well, there's only half an acre. So I said, well, it's probably not worth doing half an acre. But there's a piece of land that apparently was an event field also on the, or event area. And so they went back and saw if it could be changed for use. And so in fact this summer we're going to it's now an acre just up from Music Meadow. It doesn't look like that on the map, but actually it is. And then further up, I've just been contacted by LMH head gardener asking if we could come and look at the land there. I also know the head gardener of Magdalen, and we've sort of given them seeds to propagate. They've got a new apprentice, and so they're propagating seeds from Longmead for the Magdalen meadows, which, as you may know, they're not in great shape. Actually, they for many years they were taking silage instead of hay, and so it's kind of deteriorated quite significantly. So well, I'll talk about it a bit later, but the amazing thing is that actually this sort of peer-to-peer knowledge exchange between the head gardeners or between farmers when we're living in the landscape operates very effectively and quite efficiently, and over time. So we've also, in 2023, now acquired leases on these two areas, these two pieces of land, which we will be restoring in this year. We have started, and here it's directly with the community, driven by the community, including the local experts who live in the community. In this. And also our local experts are now engaging with the gravel extractor Smiths, who own the land. They've given us a lease on this land, and then they're hoping to extract gravel on the land behind it, about another 50 hectares. And we've had meetings with them last month to talk about, if they get planning permission, that they will come to us for a plan for the restoration of the site. This last piece of land here, this belongs to the County Council. Wharf Farm also goes back to the Cassington Road, which is here, another 100 acres, and they are in discussion about taking it. It's also in the minerals plan. They are now talking about taking this, at least the Riverside meadow, out of the minerals plan, and we're pushing them to take the whole Wharf Farm out of the minerals plan, which will give another 100 acres. So a really substantial kind of block in this area is quite far down the road to creating a serious nature recovery network for Oxfordshire. And what I'll be talking about is just that it's actually driven and undertaken by the local community. In this area too, here we have Ensham, a settlement of 2,000 houses. There's a lot of development planned around Ensham, garden village around here, and development here, and gravel extraction here. So in fact, it's a really important, the only outlet into nature is down into Longmead and the meadows beyond it. But around Ensham are about 10 other villages that are connected in to our nature recovery network. They all have their own small organizations and do their own thing to a greater or lesser extent. But when we have big projects like, I'll be talking later about our Hedge in Time project and our schools network, we come together to carry out those kinds of projects. So this is the nature recovery network that we established. When we started in 2018, we started getting invited to the kind of county level meetings about how we would go, how the county would go ahead and establish nature recovery networks on the ground. And we were aware that there were no landowners and no community groups involved in the meetings. That's a change now a lot with the local nature partnership and the new local nature recovery strategy. But at that moment, we were the only people in these meetings. And coming back from one of them, Kevin just said, we need to get the rubber on the road. And so based effectively on his network for studying the brain, a flat network, connecting up people for a particular purpose. We translated that into this sort of local situation. And so the idea being that connecting up experts where they live with enthusiasts and parish councils and schools. So instead of the model, the top-down model, where you have a small organization with a board and a chair, which immediately limits you to what you can do, it enables a kind of scalability, because anybody, as long as you connect up a person with an idea with a person who knows how to do it, it's infinitely scalable. People at the beginning, when we started, talked about mission creep. I see it much more like lighting little fires. And some of them flare up and burn beautifully. Some flare up and die down. Some are slow burn, and then. But as long as you keep connecting people and facilitating people within their peer groups, it's sustainable and expandable. So, and it's slightly different from the conventional model that we found in the county, where NGOs will come into a community with a project and 1 or 2 year funding, and then the funding runs out and the community is left without the resources and often without the skills to sustain the project. We have 2 examples in Ensham. One, a willow coppice that was actually grown in the floodplain meadow, and then a woodland that one of the NGOs came in with funding for 2 years and 20 years ago, and is still trying to persuade one of the community organizations to take it over. The other kind of process here was to try and get all the little organizations doing things to connect up together and work together, so the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And then also connecting with the local businesses. And of course, we find that local businesses are very keen to support local endeavors. So it scales very well. And then for the individual, the conventional model is what can the individual do? And the direction is, volunteer on your local wildlife site. Whereas for the individual, it's a case of sort of charity begins at home. If you volunteer on your doorstep, you don't have to get into your car and drive 15 miles to do your volunteering, and then another 15 miles to see the effects of your work. It's there on your doorstep every time you walk out of the house. And not only that, if you're volunteering with your neighbor, then there's a conversation that gets set up, admiring the results of your collective efforts, and then a communication across communities. So this is the network, the nature recovery network of land that our network of people are connected into. So this is Longmead here. This is another ancient meadow. These are the 2000 sort of old restoration meadows, 20 years old, that are doing very well. This is at Pink Hill Farms, a meadow that we restored in 2021. This we restored in 2022. And then this is the older 2013 meadow. So this is the kind of block physically on the ground. So of course, in the context of environmental organizations and universities, and so we see these fantastically species-rich floodplain meadows as nature conservation. But the extraordinary thing about meadows are that they're an integral part still of 21st century agriculture. The problem is that the culture is on the verge of extinction, and because there's so few of them left. But those farmers who do have them know exactly where they fit into 21st century agriculture. So at the bottom here are cattle from FEI farms, which many of you know, at Whiteham. They graze our meadows in the autumn. When we first went to them in 2018, when we set up the restoration project and suggested that they might like to restore with us some of their riverside meadows across the river from our area. And the then director, Claire Hill, said rather scathingly, you must understand we're a commercial farm, we can't get engaged in that kind of thing. And they work with McDonald's. But then about 2 years later, she had a sort of road to Damascus conversion, and they went into regenerative farming. And so they're a fantastic advocate now for the value of these meadows, because they found that they now, the economics absolutely stack up, feeding their livestock entirely on species-rich meadows. Not only do they feed them less and they have no inputs, but they actually finish them, i.e. take them to market in less time than they did feeding them on monoculture calorific ryegrass. So they used to finish them in 26 months, and now they finish them in 22 months, where the national average is 36 months. So the economics are there. Further upstream of us is a dairy farmer, friends of ours, the Farrants. They feed their species-rich meadows to their dry cattle, i.e. just before they're going to give birth, because it avoids fatty liver disease, which is a serious condition for cows if they're fed on too calorific food. In many ways, it is the equivalent of the humans' fast food or your 5 a day. And actually, old farmers used to call these meadows the hospital fields. Every time you had a sick cattle or calf or sheep, you brought them into the meadows, and they found what they needed to, and you didn't need to call the vet. And of course, many of our medicines, salicylic acid, which is the ingredient in aspirin, is found in meadowsweet. So for humans too, they were the kind of the pharmacy historically. Here, just this little picture of the meadow, you just see the species richness of these meadows. We have over 40 different species of plant per meter square, 120 different species altogether. And of course, that makes them very resilient. So these are floods in 2020. This is the crop of the neighboring arable field, lost entirely, and in the floodplain meadows, floodplains around us, all the arable was lost in that year. This is Longmead's crop in the same year. And of course, in a dry year, the topography means that there's a huge variety of plants that prefer the wetter years, and other plants that prefer the dry years. So you never have crop failure. You've always got something. And actually, interestingly, a number of our neighbors have suggested that if the crop fails again, they will come to us for meadow restoration. So as well as connecting downstream to Pixie Mead, we are also talking to the landowners up as far as Stanton Harcourt. So in the next few years, there really is a real potential of creating. So when we connect down to Yarnton and Pixie, that will be about 500 hectares. If we get upstream to Stanton Harcourt, it will be considerably more. This was a drone picture that Kevin took this in the floods of this year. We've had longer, deeper, and more frequent floods this year than we've ever had in the last 25 years. So this is the arable in the picture that we showed you before. This is the topsoil that's running off it. And Kevin put the drone up on every flood. So at every flood, the topsoil comes off. In fact, there is no topsoil there anymore. So in order for the crops to grow, they are covered in fertilizers, which also come down with the crop. So on this side are the meadows, and you can just interestingly you can just see the clarity of the water on on the meadow size and the problem with the arrow wall. So of course, then there's pollutants going into our rivers and so on. So this is on the other side of Longmead, going on down. These are the meadows that we've taken leases on. This is Whiteham here. The river goes along here. So this whole swathe from those 3 arable meadows are going all the way down the Thames, essentially. So can we succeed in creating floodplain meadows? It's a tough job. This is a piece of research done by the Floodplain Meadows Partnership in 2020, looking at 163 sites. And they came up with a 25% success rate. And I have to say that success was an extremely low bar. It was 15 species per meter square, where on Longmead we have over 40 species per meter square. A piece of research by the CEH predicted that it would take 150 years for the majority of species to colonize a new site. So we have to be really clear that what we're talking about is not recreating ancient meadows. It is irreplaceable habitat. And we all need to be very clear about that when development encroaches on the tiny, tiny fragment that we have left in the UK. The Floodplain Meadows Partnership came up with several indicators of success. The key one being ongoing management. Public ownership was an interesting indicator of success, with private ownership being more likely to be successful than public ownership. What they didn't look at, and what we're very concerned with, was the initial preparation and creation of, how you do it in the first place. They didn't look at that because they didn't have the data. So since 2018, we've been documenting very meticulously what we do and looking at what works and what doesn't work, because there's now a great flurry of interest in creating meadows, but actually it's still kind of finger in the wind as to how you do it. So we're collecting data. So they were looking only at botanical data. So we have been looking at invertebrate. We've got an ongoing invertebrate study looking at the extent to which when you increase the botanical diversity, to what extent the invertebrate diversity also increases. We're also looking, again, coming back to this idea of an interdisciplinary approach, a range of other species and taxa. And again, this is where we can get the community involved. So, and just going to one starting point, Longmead has 120 different species. If you're using a commercial seed mix, the most you'll get is, so British Flora does 32, Charles Flower Seed, who's a good friend of ours, does 26. Of these, about 20 are forbs, and the rest are grasses. So the reason why so few species are sold commercially is that it's really difficult to extract the seed from many of them, as we discovered with our plant propagation group. So with our community group, it's very slow, but we're growing by hand around 50 species from Longmead and other sites. So surveying, understanding what's there in the first place and what might come as we start restoring. And so again, the idea of connecting local experts where they live instead of bringing them in, so that they can at the same time survey the projects that we're involved with, but also simultaneously train groups of local people who are interested, so that the idea is that over time, over 10 years or so, we can build up a cadre of local people that both know their land and can protect it. So this is our invertebrate study, looking at to what extent invertebrate species increase as botanical diversity increases. So we're looking at flies, bees, beetles, spiders, hoppers, and butterflies. And we've done a pilot project over the last 3 years. One of the key findings of that is that there's significant variance year on year, and interestingly little overlap of species between sites. We've identified some rare species on Longmead, but basically we need more data. This is Longmead here, and then these are the 2 meadows that we've taken on now to restore. One is ex-arable and the other is permanent pasture. And then we have as a comparison the restoration that we did in 2013. We're working with Oxford Brookes and the Natural History Museum, and we've been funded by Natural England. But the entomologists are all local experts. So the idea being that if grants, we can carry the projects between grants because they're all committed to the place as well as the project. So there's a kind of sustainability built in, and we hope to continue it over a significant length of time. Oops. So this was just actually over the last week, setting up the transect. So our Wednesday group, which includes our adults with learning disability and people with mental health challenges, we went and set out the transects for the entomologists. And then on Sunday, Francis Watkins, who's part of the Ashmolean Natural History Society, and is doing our botanical surveys, led the community botanists in surveying the quadrats for the study. We have a partnership with the Open University looking at carbon sequestration in floodplain meadows, and this was funded by ICAVA. So the roots of floodplain meadow plants go down amazingly deeply. We see here almost down to 3 meters. And initial findings from them from the floodplain meadows partnership study suggest that they store carbon, large amounts of carbon in their first 10 centimeters, and are likely to equate with peat bogs in their capacity for carbon storage. So as I was saying, our focus is very much has been on how you do the preparation. In a sense, one knows from gardening that if you fail to prepare, you need to be prepared to fail. And at the moment, there's no clear protocol of what works and what doesn't work. So tools for the job, whether you're doing the Ensham churchyard or this is Merton, the Merton Meadows. This was Christchurch Meadows. So here we've got a power harrow because the ground was extremely hard, and the chain harrow, which you would use, the sort of lightest touch, just didn't make it. So we had to go slightly stronger with that. In Merton, we cultivated in strips, partly because not in the Great Meadow, but in Music Meadow, there was a bit of meadowsweet and a couple of other things. The idea being that you didn't destroy the whole meadow. But what's been very interesting about that is that actually, even in the cultivated areas, the original perennial plants have survived, and the yellow rattle, which was only sown into the cultivated areas, has migrated into the areas that we didn't cultivate. timing of the seed, absolutely critical. There's a moment when in the using the forage harvester where the seed is on the plant and then it falls. And of course, that's different species are ripening at a different time. So what you get is only a snapshot. But what has been very interesting, we've also worked with a commercial seed mix, is you'd imagine with a commercial seed mix that you could have anything you want. But on one of the Pink Hill sites, half the meadow was done with a commercial mix and the other half with green hay from Longmead. And the plants 10 years later that have survived are effectively the same plants. Interestingly, the difference is that the green hay emerges more like a tapestry with the plants very closely interwoven, and the commercial seed mix ends up more like a patchwork with large clumps of different species. So this is where the community comes in to the project, collecting seed and growing it on by hand. I'll talk about that just a bit later on. So getting the coverage. This was Christchurch Meadows in 2020. We had to take it in by trailer because the farmer was anxious. The forage harvester's wheels are on the outside of the track, and he was concerned about running over cyclists in Oxford. So he took it in a trailer and dumped it, and then put it into the muck spreader, which is what you use to create your carpet. But the seed, this was July, and it heats up. The grass heats up very quickly, and so by the time we got there, you put your hand in, it was still very warm. So there's a timing element to the whole process, both in terms of getting the seed at the right time before it drops, and also time between the donor site and the recipient site. So very much, apart from the importance of local provenance, you can only use green hay for very local sites. This was Christchurch. We had a rather old forest muck spreader in the first year, and there was some defect. You can see that. So in fact, we ended up having to rake out some of the kind of lumps of green hay that hadn't been spread so finely. This was on Pink Hill the following year, where there was a much more effective muck spreader. And then, of course, doing it by hand, here we mix it with sand so that you can make sure that you can see that the coverage is even. Ensuring germination, so rollers. So the two rolling sites here, agricultural machinery has got so big in the last few years and floodplain meadows, typically either the recipient sites or the donor sites tend to be rather small with ancient bridges. And so 2 years ago, we ended up not being able to take the green hay from a neighbouring site because we couldn't find machinery small enough to get across the bridge. This farmer who we did Christchurch with, who has lots of old small machinery, sadly has retired. So we have actually managed to get small kit with a grant from Natural England for this year. So rolling the seed to make sure it makes good contact with the soil. Christchurch had an additional operator for us. The badgers got in just after we'd created the meadow and rootled around all autumn. We thought the whole thing was going to be a disaster because then it flooded from December till March. But actually, it's been one of the most successful sites over in its sort of last 2 years. So this is Christchurch 2 years on. This was 2022, already coming up with the devil's bit scabious, one of the rarest species that have been lost from many of these meadows. These are ones we propagated by hand and planted them in. This is Merton Meadow, also after 2 years, with the hand propagated devil's bit scabious. in it. So Devil's Bit scabious, even on Longmead, was recorded in the 1970s, but when we took it over, it was no longer there. So this is one of the key species we're propagating by hand, particularly as the marsh fritillary butterfly is entirely dependent on it and has gone extinct in Oxfordshire. So what is success? Well, we were quite chuffed that Christchurch got the runner-up for the Vice-Chancellor's Environmental Sustainability Project in 2023, I think it was. But as I said earlier, it's successful for people. Everyone is delighted with these projects. The universities are managing, well, Christchurch and Merton have managed to, are celebrating them fantastically and finding them a good PR tool. In fact, I was at Christchurch last week where they've established an endowment fund hoping to get 220,000 a year for the meadow. Merton has done a similar thing. I think they've got 30,000 a year for the meadows. The slight concern about that, about getting funding for meadows, they're both now paying farmers to bring their sheep in and to cut the hay, is that there's a danger for the wider landscape where small farmers and small landowners are not going to be able to pay for that, and it takes its value as an economic crop away from it if it becomes this conservation tool. It is one of the very few habitats where land sharing is critical. You know, it is part of agriculture. And so it's really the poster child of land sharing. These are the community meadows, Ensham playing fields. We created 1.6 acres of floodplain meadow within the playing field itself. This is 3 years on. This is a very small meadow in a close in Ensham, also 3 years on, and then a community orchard meadow. So within Ensham, we created 5 community meadows that also connect out into the landscape scale restoration. As I said before, success in terms of creating floodplain, the species richness of floodplain meadows is far down the line if we get there. Yellow rattle, considered to be the great boon of creating meadows. We think it really is. Our partners at the Open University point out that it's also not only parasitic on the grasses, which is what reduces their vigor and enables the wildflowers to establish, but it also parasitizes other plants. But in our experience over the last 10 years, if you don't have yellow rattle, you won't succeed. And in fact, Floodplain Meadows botanists did a survey of Christchurch last year and recommended that they cut early in June in order to eliminate some of the yellow rattle. In fact, they can't do that because it's in an agri-environment scheme. But also this year, there is no yellow rattle because the spring floods eliminated it itself. So one doesn't need to intervene in that respect. And interestingly, on the mound towards the boardwalk, which was out of the floods, there is a lot of yellow rattle there. And for us, it's interesting because we didn't cultivate that because there were cowslips there already, but cut it very short. So the yellow rattle has actually managed to get in without cultivation, which is an interesting observation for us. Ongoing management. So this was one of the things that the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, the indicator of success, that this is absolutely critical. If you don't have your annual hay cut plus your grazing or a second cut, you're not going to succeed. So this is again the ancient playing fields. There are too many dogs there in order to get to enable to get livestock on. So we do a second cut with a forage harvester. At Merton, amazingly, we managed to persuade the college and our neighbouring farmer to take his sheep into Merton Meadows. And I met quite recently a student who lives in this block here, who said she was amazed to wake up one morning and find sheep outside her window. Cutting early enough. Everybody thinks you need to wait for all the seeds to set, but essentially they're perennials. All the plants in a hay meadow are perennial, except for a yellow rattle and a couple of the grasses. So one needs to think of it a bit more like pruning your roses rather than waiting for all the seeds to set. There's also a concern often about invertebrates in floodplain meadows, and that's what we're looking at. Do they work for invertebrates? Our data to date suggests they absolutely do. Most farmers leave a good margin around the edge of their meadows of longer grass for invertebrates to escape to. But the really interesting thing is we found that if you cut early, and of course cutting is absolutely determined by the weather. If you have a gap of a few dry days any time after the end of June, you need to cut, because like last year, we didn't manage to cut until September, and that really inhibits the ongoing success of the meadow. But interestingly, if you cut, so this was 2022 when we cut on the 10th of July, and this picture is taken on the 11th of August, and it's flowering again. Most species were flowering again, which means that you have this really late nectar source right into the autumn.
So, just keeping an eye on the clock.
Right, okay.
I don't know how many more slides you have. I want to leave a few minutes for questions.
Yes, okay. So this was propagating by, I'll just do a couple more of the plant propagation. So these are the plants we propagate by hand. So, and then peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, absolutely critical for expanding and sustainability. So here we had the primary school, secondary school, alternative curriculum students come to us every couple of weeks. And here they were in the primary school helping to create a meadow for them. We had a schools project with the 8 schools in the Ancient Partnership Academy, again, connecting up teachers across the schools and connecting the community into the schools to support them. And then connecting across communities, Hedge and Thyme project, creating hedgerows between the villages and trying to connect up through our meadow restoration areas by hedgerow. So this was Ensham to South Lee on the left here. And then the success of our community-based plant propagation. So in 2022, we created 4,000 plants for planting out in our landscape restoration. So this is at Christchurch with the University Nature Conservation Society. These are our working with disabled, physically disabled adults, as well as adults with learning disabilities. So the whole community is involved in the plant propagation process. And then we're collecting data both for management and for our own learning. Interestingly, a number of the species don't have monographs on them. So, for example, so we're actually gathering data that is of significance, wider significance. Marsh marigold, for example, the literature suggests needs vernalization. Actually, if you plant it straight from the field, we found that it germinates within about a month. So looking at the longevity of seed over time, and then monitoring our hand propagated plants in the field. So we take the GPS and put an aluminium disc at each planting site, and then we find them using a metal detector. So this final slide is we also have an art science project that's connected into it. This is the piece Precious Resource by Alice Walker, won an international art competition looking at the rarity and danger of floodplain meadows. Our youth theatre interviewed all the people around, in and around Ensham, connected with nature, and then produced this fantastic performance called Taller Than the Trees, based on their interviews. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely terrific. There's so much I learned there, both about the practice of restoration, but also the wider network you've created. We're a bit over time. I know some people have dropped off, but if you're willing, we could ask if you have about 5 minutes for questions. Anybody has some? I have loads, but I know I'll be seeing you in Longmead in a couple of weeks' time, so I'll save them for then. In particular, I think around what you see as a possible role for the university and what we could do that could support some of your research and or ask interesting questions in your network, but we can discuss them when we're out there. Alison.
Yeah, hi. Unfortunately, my laptop failed. I missed a crucial bit, which is a bit about all the invertebrates, but that's what I'm really interested in. And I think it's fantastic that you're really, focusing on the invertebrates as well as the plant species, and also that you've got the huge network, which makes it really valuable. And I was just wondering, in view of your finding that with the green hay, that nothing emerged from your emergence traps, if there's any scope to look at differences in kind of harvesting methods. I mean, obviously, it's possibly not really surprising that nothing emerges if you've kind of harvested it in a massive machine, transported it in the hot weather, and then rolled it into the ground. So, but
actually, they took the hay before we transported it. So
okay,
it was literally just blown into.
Right.
So it wouldn't have been. No, it wasn't squash, but
okay,
nevertheless, there was nothing.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that there aren't eggs and all sorts. We just didn't go. It was just a sort of one-off.
Yes. But I'm just wondering if any scope to compare that with other harvesting methods like the scything, for example, because you might expect intuitively that would be less damaging to the invertebrates, and also with the cutting times. You mentioned the fact that you get a second flowering after about 4 weeks, but is there any scope for like staggering the cutting times across the landscape to make sure there's always some resource and you don't cut everything at the same time and leave a kind of big gap for invertebrates to survive with no food for 4 weeks?
Well, I mean, of course, historically, that's how they did cut. You did it with scythe, and you started in June and finished at the end of July. But that's not. But scything obviously is not viable on a large scale. That's what we do in the community meadows, a small community. But even then, only relatively small meadows. It's quite tiring and time-consuming. So. So we've got now taken on this 20 hectares that we will be managing ourselves, which is a really exciting development for us. So we can start experimenting with all that kind of thing. Now, up till now, we've been doing the restoration on other landowners' sites. So it opens up new opportunities, both for this community engagement, but also for the research side of it.
Great, thanks.
And Victoria?
Hi, Catriona. You're always such an inspiration. I love listening to you. Give me hope. So I want to just ask two things. So firstly, was more of an observation, is that I think you're a wonderful example of how long it takes and the persistence it takes and the imagination it takes to actually deliver this stuff on the ground. And I think that that is something that cannot be underestimated. So that's just an observation. So the other probably crucially important thing is I know you've been in touch with Caroline Svensson very extensively about getting some sort of designation for the area that, or Longmead itself and some of the other areas you're working with. And I just wanted to know what the progress is with that.
Well, yes, we talked about multiple SSSIs, but realistically, it's a kind of 10-year project if it's successful at all. The only other glimmer of hope in our particular area is now the county council, who we thought that acquiring their land, a lease on their land, was the low-hanging fruit in 2018. But in the meantime, we've restored about 70 hectares, and we've finally got, well, actually a 1-year lease, but we had a very good meeting with last month, and the understanding is that that will continue, and also that this wolf farm, the Riverside Meadows, will go into restoration, and hopefully the rest of the farm being taken out of minerals plan, which would be very exciting. And Pete Subring and Liz Leffman are kind of quite committed to our project and are trying to work with it. And so if that happens, it will be really, really exciting. And they are talking about getting it included in the nature recovery strategy and so on. So it's all up in the air at the moment, but the omens are kind of relatively good.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? And Ben, you want to ask them?
Sorry, I'm relatively new to this Zoom app platform. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a thank you to the amazing work that's going on, but secondly to acknowledge the consequential impact this has, that is not nature benefiting, but is the people benefiting, the links within the community, the mental health improvements. And my own story, I came into nature and conservation through the inspiration of Julie Webb, who runs grassland protection projects around Oxford, including my local park. So I'm very grateful, both personally and sort of professionally, to you. Thank you very much.
Well, Judy Webb's our fairy godmother, so. But no, the people side of it is completely extraordinary. I mean, our plant propagation group, which meets every Wednesday, we call it plant propagation very, very determinedly, although it includes normally what we do is called social farming or care farming. But because we are bringing everybody together, including people with learning disabilities and their carers, who tend to be very recent immigrants. The payment for carers is extremely low, and it also offers a visa into Britain. So we have a number of people who've arrived in the UK in the last year who are acting as carers for the people with learning disability and autism. And part of our project is to bring these isolated communities back into the centre of our local community group. And so what I hadn't, it's not what one anticipated, but we're also providing a community for recent immigrants who happen to come along as carers. So so it's a very interesting, it's evolved in a really interesting way for me. And actually Wednesdays are my therapy day too.
Fantastic. Well, one thing I was intrigued is the fact that the shared use is an integral part of the thriving of the biodiversity on these meadows. What is known about how they were like pre-agricultural? Was it large sort of herbivores that maintained a lot of these species, or are these very much an anthropogenic agricultural landscape?
My sense is that they are anthropogenic because it's floodplain. And relatively fertile, relative to I mean, before the advent of artificial fertilizers. I think that it's the mowing and the grazing that stops the succession in that particular context. The only place where they still thrive naturally is in Siberia. And the assumption there is that the hard frosts do the job of grazing and cutting.
So in the absence of that, you'd expect these to go into sort of car woodlands, or what would be the?
Yeah, yes. I mean, in the Witchwood forests, in medieval times, went down to the river where it could, but early maps show that Longmead was actually a lot meadow. And so anybody who had a cow or sheep in Ensham had a right to a strip of Longmead for hay, and then common grazing afterwards. And Yarnton was similarly a lot meadow, and Pixie Mead. In fact, they all were. And because in the Doomsday Book, it was the most valuable, these floodplain meadows were the most valuable land in the country, because they received this helping of silt every year in the floods.
Yeah. So I have another question. There's one final question for me. You argued that in terms of farming, it makes economic sense to actually feed the cows on these meadows in terms of time to turning. So what are the barriers for wider adoption if the economics make so much sense? Is it just mindset? Is it other factors that we need to think about as well?
It's the existence of the meadows themselves, essentially. You know, where they. So, I mean, our experience of is just 2 farms. Essentially, we haven't done research beyond the people that we know and the meadows that we know. But FAI Farms, which is a big commercial enterprise, you know, that's their experience of turning over to using the species-rich meadows. But they're, I mean, in the floodplain, in the experience in the areas that we know, there's so few of them that until you recreate them, there isn't the incentive in any case. I mean, there isn't the possibility.
So there's going to be, I think, Catriona, you're going to help the cluster, aren't you, trying to re-establish quite a lot of meadows across the network in the landscape scale trial. So I think that will spread the word, as you said, peer-to-peer very successfully. And of course, groundswell and the whole sort of regenerative agricultural idea, which is actually quite well backed by ELMS and the funding, even in SFI, which is the sort of lowest level. I think there's a lot that's working in the right direction for this at the moment. So I'm quite hopeful that a lot more farmers will jump onto this particular idea, particularly if they're dealing with land that's been flooded much more persistently, because clearly they can't do anything else with it.
There's another little concern in the back of my mind, is that there is a great interest in doing it now, and the number of original meadows, if you're going to take green hay, is tiny, and there is a concern of kind of killing the goose that lays the golden egg. How we're going to manage this kind of precious resource and what we've got left of it. So that's something for slightly further down the line, but not very far down the line.
I think it's still working in the right direction compared to where it was even probably 7 or 8 years ago. There's a huge change going on.
Okay, thank you. I think we should probably wrap up now. But that was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that, and I think that was lovely to actually have you give a full seminar on these, maybe in our Friday seminar series, maybe next year. A lovely example to share with our students and with wider groups as well. Okay, so thank you very much. We'll wrap up, and so next month, this meeting will be 1 week earlier than usual, so it'll be January the 5th, I think. So it's the Wednesday. Is it the 5th? Colin? I don't know. But anyway, it'll be a week earlier. Colin will send around the information. So have a lovely month.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.